Welcome to The Bitter Witness.
Don't be scared.
Hello, welcome back. I'm Rebecca, your host for The Bitter Witness. I hope you've had a good week. I've had a very busy week. As you know, I'm very involved in my local community theatre here in my little corner of Ontario. And we've opened our production this week. We've had one successful weekend and we're heading into our second this weekend. So hopefully we have another successful weekend. If you like the show, or if you have suggestions for the show, or if you just want to drop a line and say hi to me, you can email me at thebitterwitness@gmail.com. Just remember, if you're an ass, I won't respond. Also, if you do enjoy the show, please head over to our Patreon page, The Bitter Witness, at patreon.com, and support the show. For a few cents a day, you can have exclusive access to the Bitter Bits. Let's see, what else? It's raining in my little corner of Ontario, and it has been absolutely beautiful here. We've hit 17, 18, 19 degrees Celsius, and I couldn't be happier. It is just fabulous. I'm in my shorts, my flip-flops. I am living the dream. Both the dogs are asleep, so ASMR snoring will be brought to you by both Miley and Piper today. So grab a cup of tea, sit back, relax, while I tell you about the murder of Bob Crane. As always, I want to give our victims in the case top billing. Bob, I acknowledge you and I send my love to you wherever you may be. Just a quick trigger warning. This case involves a brutal beating and there are some sexual exploits in it, I'll say. So let's get into it. This case is a little different because it's very well known, and so I'm going to give you a quick introduction to Bob Crane. Then we're going to discuss the murder, the crime scene, and the investigation. This is just a little introduction to Bob Crane. We all know Bob Crane because he was the star of Hogan's Heroes, and the Bob Crane murder is infamous in that it has not been solved. So I'm going to just give you a quick introduction to who Bob Crane was, and then we're going to get into the murder. So Bob Crane was born on July 13th, 1928 in Waterbury, Connecticut. He was the younger of two sons of Rosemarie and Alfred Thomas Crane. From all accounts, he had a pretty normal and happy childhood. His mom was a homemaker and his father was a pharmacist. Bob began playing drums at the age of 11 and showed great signs of aptitude in drumming. Very musically inclined. By junior high, he was organizing local drum and bugle parades with his neighborhood friends. He joined his high school's orchestra and its marching and jazz bands. Bob also played for the Connecticut and Norwalk Symphony Orchestras as part of their youth orchestra program. He graduated from Stamford High School in 1946. Then, in 1948, he enlisted for 2 years in the Connecticut Army National Guard and was honorably discharged in 1950. In 1949, he married his high school sweetheart, Ann Terzian. The couple had 3 children, Robert Jr., Deborah, and Karen. In 1950, when Bob was discharged from the Army, he began his career in radio broadcasting in New York. Soon he moved to Connecticut stations, and in 1956, Bob was hired by CBS Radio to host the morning show at its West Coast station in LA. Once in LA, Bob filled the broadcasts with sly wit, drumming A-list guests, Marilyn Monroe, Frank Sinatra, Bob Hope, just to name a few. Very fast, his show topped the morning ratings, and Bob became king of the LA airwaves. Bob also had ambitions to act, and this led to a spot of guest hosting for Johnny Carson on the game show Who Do You Trust? He also had appearances on The Twilight Zone, Alfred Hitchcock Presents, General Electric Theater. One day, Carl Reiner appeared on Bob's radio show. Bob persuaded Reiner to book him as a guest appearance on the Dick Van Dyke Show. Reiner followed through with the promise and booked him on the Dick Van Dyke Show. While on the Dick Van Dyke Show, Donna Reed saw Bob and offered him a guest shot on her program. After the success of the episode that Bob was on, playing the character Dr. David Kelsey, he was then incorporated into the show's storyline and he became a regular cast member. In 1964, he left Donna Reed's show. And in 1965, Bob was offered the starring role and the one role that we all fell in love with Bob in a television sitcom set in a World War II POW camp called Hogan's Heroes. Hogan's Heroes involved the sabotage and espionage missions of Allied soldiers, led by Colonel Robert Hogan, from under the noses of the oblivious Germans guarding them. The show was an immediate hit, finishing in the top 10 in its first year. The series only lasted for 6 seasons, and Bob had been nominated for an Emmy Award in both 1966 and 1967. I find it odd that Hogan's Heroes was such a hit, considering that World War II and the horrible, horrible atrocities that happened in that war had only ended like 20 years before Hogan's Heroes was created. But I guess making fun of the Nazis maybe helped America with some of its trauma. A little side note of trivia about Hogan's Heroes: 4 of the German Nazis in the show, Werner Klemperer, I hope I said that right, who played Colonel Klink, John Banner, who played Sergeant Schultz, and Leon Askin, who played General Burkhalter, and Robert Clary, who played Corporal LeBeau. They were all Jewish men who had survived the Holocaust. Corporal LeBeau, or Robert Clary in real life, had actually been interred at Buchenwald and lost his parents at Auschwitz. Robert Clary died in November of 2022. He lived to the beautiful age of 96. He was stated in an interview as saying that Hogan's Heroes was well directed, well written, and well acted, and it was a great group to work with. He said of Bob never said, "Hey, I'm Hogan, and I'm the star." After his wildly successful run as Hogan on Hogan's Heroes, Bob found himself without the piles and piles of offers for parts that he thought might be rolling in. Many of the offers that he did receive were just for a guest appearance on a TV show, mostly for just 1 or 2 episodes, such as The Doris Day Show, Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In. He had a couple of TV movies, but nothing as significant as Hogan's Heroes. Eventually, in 1973, Bob received an offer from Disney to take the lead role of Charlie McCready in Disney's movie Superdad, alongside Kurt Russell and Dick Van Patten. Now, many actors have started great careers with Disney, but unfortunately for Bob, he wasn't one of them. Now, during his run on Hogan's Heroes, Bob started a love affair with his co-star Cynthia Lynn, the actress who played Helga. But then that ended, and Bob began a romantic affair with the woman who replaced Cynthia Lynn, Patricia Olsen. She played Hilda, but she was known under the stage name of Sigrid Valdez. In 1970, Bob divorced Ann Terzian, and then he married Patricia Olsen. We're going to call her Patricia. We're actually going to call her Patty because later on in the story, people refer to her as Patty. So we're gonna just kind of keep it fluent here, and we're gonna call her Patty Olsen. So Bob married Patty Olsen on the set of Hogan's Heroes, and his co-star Richard Dawson served as his best man. Richard Dawson starred in Hogan's Heroes, but we know him best from Family Feud. He always creeped me out when he kissed everybody on Family Feud. Like, he could protrude his lips so far because he had to lean over that table thing that they stand behind. And even as a kid, it freaked me out. He kissed everybody. I'm sure Richard Dawson is a beautiful man or was a beautiful man. I don't know much about Richard Dawson, so no ill will to Richard Dawson. But it creeped me out as a kid. I'm just saying. Patty and Bob had a son in 1971 and they named him Scotty. Later on, they adopted a daughter, Anna Marie. Now, Bob Jr., Bob's son with Ann Terzian, later revealed in his book that Bob was not the biological father of Scotty, that in fact Patty was pregnant with someone else's child when Bob married her. And Bob Jr. stated that Bob had had a vasectomy in 1968 while he was still married to Anne. I don't know if that's true or not. We can only take what Bob Jr. is saying because that's the only reference I could find to it. But Bob and Patty separated in 1977 and were mere days away from finalizing their divorce at the time of Bob's death in June of 1978. Now, from all accounts, from all of Bob's children that I've seen their interviews and read some of their books and read interviews in newspapers, the only thing I could find about Bob being a father was that he was a wonderful father. He was loving, made sure his family was supported, and he was a great dad. He was there for them. Now, Bob Crane and his murder revealed something in Bob's personal life that I'm sure you are well aware of if you've ever read anything about the Bob Crane murder. Everybody goes directly to this because it's sensational and it sells papers. Sex sells, right? So Bob had, I would term it as a sex addiction. He enjoyed it. He enjoyed sex. He enjoyed having sex with other people other than his wife. And Bob reveled in it. And to Bob, it was something natural. It wasn't something that was anything to be ashamed of. It was Bob's feelings about it were that it was natural. Bob also had a fascination with the new technology that was coming out at the time. Remember, this is the late 60s, early 70s, and VCRs and cameras and editing machines and film, all of the new technologies are starting to come out and they're big ticket items. And Bob was fascinated with them. He loved cameras and videos and he loved film and editing them. And Bob combined his two loves, sex and new technology, and he enjoyed filming his sexual escapades with the women that he met. And he used his celebrity to meet these women and to take them home and have consensual sex. Now, only in one thing that I read did I read that Bob had rigged up his apartment to secretly film or photograph women when they wouldn't agree to be filmed. But I only read that once, and I didn't read it in any other police report or book on Bob or any interview, anything like that. I only read it once. If that's true and he did do that, not cool. But I'm going to take that with a grain of salt because I only saw it in one spot, and I believe it was Bob Jr. who said that. So I'm not 100% sure. In Bob's career timeline, we're at the movie Superdad with Disney. Now, Bob had this sexual addiction for some time. It had been going on for a while, and he had, at this point, amassed a huge collection of what we would call pornographic photographs and pornographic videos. And as I said, to Bob, this was absolutely normal. And so Bob was bringing the photographs of these naked women and pictures of these women in sexual positions and engaging in sex with Bob. And he would bring these pictures to the set of Superdad. And sometimes Bob's encounters would include 2, 3, or 4 people. And to Bob, he would show off his photographs and discuss what he had done with the women. And to Bob, it was natural, but to the Disney execs, it kind of seemed like a liability. You're on the set of a wholesome Disney family movie, and here you're showing off naked women pictures. So, not the best. And so for Bob, unfortunately, there were no more lead roles in Disney movies. Now, Super Dad completed filming and hit the box office, but unfortunately, it was pretty much a flop. It didn't bring in the money that Disney thought it would. And 2 years after Super Dad, Bob was approached by NBC to create and star in The Bob Crane Show. In 1975, The Bob Crane Show premiered. The premise of the show was that Bob Wilcox, played by Bob Crane, leaves his job in the insurance world to return to medical school, and hilarity ensues as this aging family man tries to deal with all the roadblocks in his way. However, only 13 episodes were produced, and again, Bob Crane's name was attached to another flop. At this point, Bob was receiving some residuals from Hogan's Heroes, and he was making some guest appearances here and there on TV shows, but there just wasn't that many job offers coming his way. And then Bob got an offer to perform in a dinner theater. And being the entrepreneur that he was, Bob bought a piece of the production. The show for the dinner theater was called Beginner's Luck, and Bob started traveling with the company all over the United States. Now, there was two things that were great for this for Bob. Not only was it steady work with a steady paycheck, but it also offered a bevy of new young women for him to try in bed. Now, in this, Bob had a best friend. His name was John Henry Carpenter. No, not the John Carpenter you're thinking of. No relation. This John Carpenter was introduced to Bob on the set of Hogan's Heroes by his co-star Richard Dawson. Like Bob, John Carpenter loved sex, and he also was fascinated with electronics and tech and things like that. He actually worked for Sony Electric at that point, which was one of the companies that was creating all the new technology. So Carpenter was actually an audiovisual expert. So the two of them just became fast friends, and they were besties. And they would go out together to bars to meet women. Bob would introduce Carpenter as his manager, which would give Carpenter the clout to impress a young, beautiful woman and convince them to come back to Bob's place and engage in their sexual exploits. Now, Carpenter worked on the road, and so when Bob went on the road with the dinner theater, Carpenter would make sure that his work would take him to the same city that Bob was in so that the two could go out and meet women and bring them back to Bob's and engage in their sexual exploits. However, Bob being on the road, it took a toll on his marriage, and as well, him having these sexual exploits was no secret in his family with his wife. Now, prior to Bob and Patty's marriage going south, which it did, Bob had changed his will and removed all of his children out of the will and left everything to Patty, which some can say, well, she probably coerced him, but you know what? He was married to her, she was his wife, and that's a common thing for spouses to do, is you just leave everything to the spouse that survives. But then they divorced, and Bob's will never got changed. And I think deep down that Bob wanted to get back with Patty, maybe. He was still in communication with Patty up until the day of his death. In fact, the night of his death, when he came out of the dinner theater, his tire had been punctured. Someone had played with the valve stem. And he turned to Carpenter, who was with him, and said, I'm supposed to call Patty tonight. So he was still in communication with Patty. But anyway, Patty and Bob divorced, and apparently, according to sources, the divorce was really, really nasty. Now, Being the ladies' man that Bob was and the successful ladies' man that he was, as well as being a celebrity, you would think that Bob Crane would be full of confidence and be extremely thick skinned and able to take conflict and face it head on. But that actually wasn't the case. In an interview, Bob said that he was extremely sensitive and that he always kept in the forefront of his mind every harsh word that had ever been written about him in the press. One of his quotes was, "I'm as thin-skinned as Jack Parr. I'm easily hurt and conflicts scare me. They really do. I run from a fight. I joke. It's a comic's defense. If they back you into a corner, throw a funny line and run." So because of the nasty divorce, Bob found himself a place in Scottsdale, Arizona, and the dinner company leased it for him. He turned this apartment into his refuge. It was a place for him to get away and hide from the divorce, and it also allowed he and Carpenter a place to permanently set up their amateur porn studio. They had the entire apartment rigged. They had cameras everywhere, equipment everywhere, film everywhere. And Bob and Carpenter would bring the young women that they met at bars back to this apartment to film and photograph and have their sexual appetites sated. Now, according to his son, Bob Jr., there were no drugs, no coercion, none of that. Women just liked him or found him handsome or whatever it was, they would hook up. So Bob is not a big drinker as well. He doesn't smoke, he doesn't do drugs, he just enjoys sex. That's just a small introduction into who Bob Crane was. He was a celebrity, he'd had his rise to fame, and then he'd had a downfall, and currently he was working in a dinner theater in Scottsdale, Arizona. And he had a best friend who helped enable his sexual exploits with his access to all the new and latest high-tech, high-ticket item technology. And now we're going to come to Bob's death. On Sunday, June 29th, 1978, Bob was supposed to attend an interview at the Television Academy. After that, he had a luncheon scheduled. However, he never showed up for either of those appointments. Victoria Berry, who was co-starring with Bob in Beginner's Luck, was supposed to do the interview with Bob, and she knew it wasn't like him not to show up and not to even call if he was, running late. And Victoria had been invited over to Bob's apartment later that afternoon to do, now I've heard either a voiceover or that Bob was going to help run lines with her. So I'm not sure what the actual reason was for Victoria to be there, but she was invited over. Victoria stated that she also thought maybe they would fool around a little bit as they had done in the past. At approximately 2 p.m., Victoria headed over to Bob's apartment to check on him. She was a little concerned. As she pulled into the parking lot of the apartment building, she saw Bob's white Chevy sitting in the parking lot in its usual spot. She made her way to the door of Bob's apartment and noticed that the morning paper was still on the sidewalk outside his front door. She picked it up and knocked several times. There was no answer. She slowly turned the handle and was surprised to find the door to Bob's apartment unlocked. Bob always locked his door. In fact, some have said that Bob was overly cautious. She thought to herself, he's got to be here. His car's in the parking lot. And thought maybe he's swimming out back. She knocked another time, then again, and then she gently pushed open the door. She called out, "Bob!" No answer. She put the paper on the kitchen table and placed the bag she was carrying on the floor as she slowly walked through the apartment. It was extremely dark. All the drapes were closed inside the apartment. And as her eyes adjusted to the darkened room, she could make out all the video equipment, cameras, and cables and film scattered all around the living room as usual. She called out for Bob again and again, no answer. Victoria walked over to the door that led to the pool in the center of the apartment complex. She thought to herself, he must be swimming. She pulled back the curtains and saw that Bob was not at the pool. Strange, she thought to herself, and turned back toward the inside of the apartment and headed for Bob's bedroom. When she got there, the door was slightly ajar, so she pushed it open. She saw that someone was lying in the bed, but she couldn't make out the form. At first, when she saw the dark streaks on the face, she thought it was a woman with long hair lying on her right side. But as her eyes adjusted to the darkness in the room, she saw it. It was blood everywhere. All over the pillow, all over the bed sheets, spatters of it were on the wall, above the bed, and the ceiling. She let out a scream. Her mind was racing. Oh my God, what the hell is going on, she thought. She could feel her heart beating in her head. At first she thought it might be a woman. One of Bob's girlfriends had killed herself. But as she fixed her gaze on the form on the bed, she realized it was a man. But was it Bob or was it Carpenter? She couldn't tell who it was from all the blood. And Carpenter often stayed with Bob when he was on the road. She just couldn't tell. The body was unrecognizable. Blood was pooling all around the face, and a lot of blood had poured out of the victim's nose. Then she noticed an electrical cord wrapped around the victim's neck. She let out another scream, backed out of the bedroom, and ran outside. Once she got outside of the apartment, she ran into a neighbor of Bob's, Mary Lou Hawkins. She was crying and hysterical. Victoria begged her for help, telling her there was a dead man inside Bob's apartment. She said she thought it was Bob, but she wasn't sure. She couldn't tell. It was awful. Hawkins and Victoria ran back to Hawkins' apartment, and Victoria called the police. Victoria made her way back to the doorway of Bob's apartment, waiting for the police to arrive. She was in a daze, shaking and crying. She was pacing back and forth outside the apartment. Can you imagine how fast her brain was racing, pacing back and forth in front of that apartment? What happened? Who was it? Who was on the bed? Where are the police? Why aren't they here? I would probably faint. I would probably faint. The police finally arrived and entered the apartment. According to the police, they didn't notice any sign of struggle inside the apartment, and in one bedroom, they found the battered body of a shirtless man sprawled in bed with 2 huge gashes above his left ear and an electrical cord knotted around his neck. According to the police report, it was clear he had been in good shape, had salt and pepper hair, but gore obliterated most of the other details of the face. Blood was splattered over the wall and ceiling of the bedroom, and the pillow that was wedged under the victim had turned from white to crimson. There were also pieces of what appeared to be brain matter and skull on the pillow. As well, on the bed near the victim's body, there was a large black bag that was unzipped and empty. Victoria told the police that she thought it was either Bob or Carpenter, but then she remembered that Carpenter was supposed to be flying back to LA that morning at 10 a.m. and Bob was supposed to have driven him to the airport. But she didn't know if Carpenter had made the flight because she hadn't spoken with Bob since the previous evening. Victoria also told the police that she had noticed there was bottles of beer inside the fridge and a bottle of scotch and gin on the counter, but that Bob didn't drink beer, scotch, or gin. And Carpenter actually didn't drink alcohol at all. And just put that little tidbit in the back of your mind for now. We'll come back to it. So the police began to canvass some of the neighbors within the complex, and eventually they located the super and learned that the apartment was leased to the dinner theater. Police contacted the theater's manager, Ed Beck, to come and identify the body. According to Beck, there was no way I could identify him from one side. The other side, yes, but not the side that was facing up and covered in blood. The police rolled the body over for Beck to identify it, and it was Bob Crane. So let's just pause for a moment and discuss some of the things that we've seen here. Number 1, why did Victoria go in the fridge? Doesn't that seem odd that you would walk into someone's apartment. You're there to check on them because they missed an appointment. They missed several appointments, and you beeline for the fridge. I understand her seeing the bottle of scotch and gin on the counter. They're in plain sight. You notice them. You also notice that they're kind of out of place because Bob doesn't really drink them and Carpenter didn't drink alcohol. But why open up the fridge? That just seemed weird to me. The other thing that is weird to me is that the police would roll the body over for Beck to identify him. And I'm going to tell you now, the police behavior in this case gets a lot worse. But I don't think it was quite necessary to identify the body at that point. You should be preserving the crime scene by limiting the number of people inside the apartment, not bringing more people in. And why you would ever roll the body is beyond me. Let's move on. Just keep those little bits in the back of your head. Now, later, once Bob's body had been removed and taken to the morgue, the police went and got his son, Bob Jr., who was, I believe, about 27, 26 at this point. And they brought him and a friend or his sister or someone, but it was more than just Bob Jr. There was a couple people. The police brought all of these people back to the crime scene, to Bob's apartment. I'm not sure why, but he says they brought him and his family back to the apartment on the day Bob was murdered. Now, remember, Bob's body is gone, but it's still a crime scene. Why in the fuck are you bringing people who weren't inside the apartment into the apartment? Why are you bringing anyone into the apartment? You need to keep that apartment as it is, exactly as it is, to get every piece of evidence out of there. I know this is the 70s, but you still need to get what evidence you can. I know that the technology for examining evidence isn't as what it is today, as in terms of advancement, but they still had some technology. So how is this I'm speechless. I'm speechless. Anyway, so this is what Bob Jr. stated in his book about his father's murder in description of the crime scene. According to Bob Jr., the place was trashed. There was empty whiskey and gin bottles on the counter. Bob didn't drink, maybe once in a blue moon at an event, but even then he would only have one. There was a pack of cigarettes and an overflowing ashtray on the coffee table. Bob never smoked. He said that mail, magazines, clothing, cables, filming equipment were strewn all over the apartment, on the couch, on the floor, on the coffee table. He said it wasn't how his father would have kept his apartment. By the door, there was a stack of film, and on top of the film was a pair of Carpenter's swim trunks. Apparently, Carpenter had left his swimsuit at Bob's apartment, and Bob was intending to give it back to Carpenter when he drove him to the airport that morning at 10 a.m. So this is telling us that Bob maybe didn't drive Carpenter to the airport at 10 a.m. because the stuff he was supposed to take was sitting at the door. One of the films in the pile was a film entitled Saturday Night Fever. It was a pornographic film that Bob and Carpenter had been filming, and Bob had been editing, and he was actually sending that back to LA with Carpenter. Bob Jr. states in his book that they were always within eyesight of the police officers that were accompanying him while they were walking through the crime scene, and that he and the people that were with him were touching everything. And this blows my mind. On the way out of the crime scene, out of the apartment, Bob Jr. opened the fridge and took a 6-pack of beer with him. I'm going to repeat that. Bob Jr., on the way out of the apartment, opened the fridge and took the 6-pack of beer with him. Now, put that in your little mind space, and we'll discuss that later as well. So now we're going to look at the investigation into Bob's death. At the time of Bob's murder, the Scottsdale, Arizona Police Department didn't even have a homicide department. They didn't have the knowledge or experience to actually conduct a solid murder investigation. They had very few murders in Scottsdale at the time, and they just weren't capable of doing it. They should have realized that at the time and called in help from another agency that had more experience in murder. But this is what they've come up with in their investigation. They found that the cord that was tied around Bob's neck was cut from a video camera that was located in one of the front bedrooms. They found blood on the back of the door, the doorknob, the curtain in the living room, the walls, on the ceiling. There was blood everywhere, but there was no sign of forced entry, and according to the police, there was no sign of a struggle, even though Bob Jr. said that the apartment was trashed. Bob was laying in bed on his right side. He was wearing a pair of white boxer shorts and a watch. He was partially covered with a sheet. It kind of went up to about his armpits. And his left hand seemed to be under his head, but I have seen it described as being under the pillow in some reports. In fact, the Scottsdale police believed from the position that the body was in that Bob was probably asleep when he was struck with the murder weapon. Now, there was a blood stain on the sheets. According to the Scottsdale police, it looked like the killer had wiped the murder weapon off on the sheets. But they didn't know what it was, and they didn't find anything in the apartment that could have really been the murder weapon. So this next part just will make your mind implode. Are you ready? I hope you're sitting down. Once the police had gotten to the scene, they called in the Maricopa County medical examiner. Dr. Heinz, Karnitschnig, we're going to call him Dr. K, because I can't say that over again, and I don't think I said it right. So Dr. K was called. He's a county medical examiner. He arrived at the apartment about 4 p.m., and by this time, it's been suggested in different publications that Bob had probably been dead for about 12 hours. And I have seen the video of what I am about to describe to you, and my mouth was agape. I could not believe it. So Dr. K comes into the bedroom and proceeds to climb on the bed next to Bob's body, pulls a straight razor out of his pocket or bag, and proceeds to shave Bob's head. No gloves, no nothing. Right there on the bed, starts to shave off Bob's head so he could get a better look at the two large blows behind Bob's left ear. Yep. He shaved the hair off of his head and dropped it on the bed, the hair that he cut off with a straight razor. He had nothing on, just jumped on the bed next to the body and started shaving and throwing the hair everywhere. I'm sorry, can you say contamination much? He then, in the video, makes note of the blood spatter on the walls and the ceiling of the bedroom. And then he states, well, we definitely have two different blows here. You know, I believe that even in 1978, Dr. K should have known better than to climb on a bed of a murder victim and shave his hair and drop the hair on the bed sheets. Just saying. Okay, I just stopped recording and went back and checked, and I have to correct something. The medical examiner was wearing gloves when he shaved the hair off of Bob's head. I'll give him that. You can find the video on the internet. I'm not going to tell you where to find it because it is an actual black and white video of Bob's body lying on the bed and everything that happens inside the room. But they were wearing gloves. My bad. I'm sorry. So not only does the medical examiner crawl onto the bed and take a straight razor and just start hacking like hacking at Bob's hair, taking chunks off of his hair and dropping them on the bed so that he can get a better look at. Oh, Bentham. Do you hear him? Bentham's meowing. Can you hear him? He shaves Bob's head down to literally to the skin and does a great big circle around his left ear so that he can have a better look at the two wounds. This is something that should be done in an autopsy in a medical examiner's morgue where it's clean and sterilized and the hair that you cut off can be captured properly. But not only that, in this video, you see a Scottsdale, Arizona police officer walk over to the body, take a knife out, like a flip knife, like a knife, out of his pocket and slice the electrical cord off of Bob's neck, which also should have been done in a morgue, but he doesn't like put it in an envelope or a plastic bag or anything like that. He wraps it into a tiny little ball and then walks away with it. So whatever's on there has either been knocked off or now has been cross-contaminated with anything else. And any fingerprints that were on that cord are probably gone because it's been all wrapped amongst itself and rubbed against itself. So, this whole thing was just a clusterfuck from the beginning. So, the official autopsy was done the next day in an actual sterilized morgue. And I've read the autopsy, and it basically just says that Bob's skull was bashed in and that the head trauma was the cause of death. The autopsy notes a small depressed mark around his neck from the electrical cord, but it states that the airway is patent, meaning unobstructed, and that there were no injuries to the soft tissue of the neck, meaning the electrical cord was not in any way the cause of death. In fact, when you look at one of the crime scene photos, if you look at the crime scene photo and if you zoom in a bit, there's no blood on the electrical cord. So, meaning that that cord was placed after the blood appeared on Bob's neck. So, why? What's the significance of the cord? Does it symbolize something? If it was a way for someone to hold Bob in place, there would have been injuries to the soft tissue around his neck. There would have been bruising, and that would have been apparent in the autopsy. Now, immediately, the Scottsdale police thought that Carpenter was the killer. They found it odd that Carpenter was supposed to fly back to LA that morning and Bob was supposed to take him to the airport, but Carpenter took a cab to the airport instead, which, according to everyone who knew Bob and Carpenter, this was totally out of character. Carpenter would never do that. He would have waited for Bob and had Bob drive him back. And beside Bob's bed, there was an address book, and inside the address book, it's clearly stated that Bob was supposed to drive Carpenter to the airport at 10 a.m. Now, Carpenter did some weird things that day. Number one, he got himself to the airport and didn't call Bob or look for Bob or sound the alarm that Bob hadn't shown up, which he should have. But then Carpenter does something really weird. Once he gets back to LA, he phones Bob Jr. Now, this is according to Bob Jr., and unfortunately, Carpenter has passed away, so we can't have him to corroborate this. But Bob Jr. states that he received a call from Carpenter saying, "I'm back in town. If you need anything, let me know." And he hung up, which Bob Jr. claims is completely out of character for Carpenter. Why would he call me? He never called me before. all of a sudden he calls to tell me he's back in LA, and it's like a quick call that doesn't mean anything. But not only that, Carpenter called Bob's apartment in Arizona twice. The first time, no one answered. The second time, a detective answered. And when the detective answered, Carpenter just asked if Bob was there. They said no, and he said okay. But according to what I read, the detective identified himself, and Carpenter never asked why a detective was answering his best friend's phone, or if his friend was okay, or what was going on. If that was my best friend and I called her house and a detective answered the phone, not only would I become immediately hysterical, thinking that, of course, someone has died or something bad has happened, I would drop the phone, jump in my car, and drive there. Right? Wouldn't you? The first natural thing that should come out of your mouth when a detective answers the phone at your best friend's house is, why are you answering this phone? What the fuck is going on? Just saying. Now, the police immediately suspected Carpenter, and in fact, I say they had tunnel vision. They never looked at anyone else for anything to do with Bob's murder. It was always Carpenter in the Scottsdale, Arizona police's mind. They impounded Carpenter's rental car, which was a white Cordoba, and that was what he had used while he was in Scottsdale. Now, in the Cordoba, they found blood smears on the doors, and the blood type that they found in the Cordoba was found to match that of Bob's. And the police state that they discovered, in quotes, that no one else with the same blood type as Bob had been in the car while Carpenter used the car. And that's okay, but who used the car before Carpenter, and was it cleaned? But that's just me thinking. And this is 1978, so there's no DNA. They only had the blood type to go by, but how well do you think they cleaned cars back in 1978? Probably not very. Unfortunately, with the evidence that they had, the case started to go cold. They did not have enough evidence against John Carpenter to make an arrest, and they didn't have any evidence against anyone else. So Bob's murder has now gone cold. But in 1989, two detectives, Rains and Vassal, we'll say Vassal, were given the green light to reopen Bob Crane's murder case. These two began sifting through the evidence that had been stored away in some evidence vault somewhere in the depths of an Arizona basement, and started to re-examine everything that was still inside the box. There is a memo that I have seen from someone in the Scottsdale, Arizona Police Department ordering all of the Bob Crane evidence to be destroyed, which is weird because when these guys are looking at it, it's only 11 years after, but someone wanted all of the evidence disposed of. But luckily that didn't happen. Approximately 8 months earlier, the FBI had set up a lab to determine genetic fingerprinting, which had been discovered by, you know this answer, Dr. Alex Jeffries. Remember him from the last episode? Colin Pitchfork? That's right. By this point, when they reopened the case, now the FBI have accepted the genetic fingerprinting and have actually opened a lab to do just that. The main thing that Rains and Vassal were trying to find out was it actually Bob Crane's blood that was found inside Carpenter's rental car back in 1978? There was a vial of blood that was inside the evidence box, miraculously. However, the blood had not been refrigerated and it had not been stored properly. So they've already got 2 strikes against them. So they sent off the blood samples from the Cordoba and the vial of Bob's blood that they had. But unfortunately, the results were inconclusive. But that doesn't mean it wasn't Bob's blood. It just means they couldn't tell what it was. It was too degraded for them to do anything with. There also wasn't enough blood in the samples from the Cordoba for them to actually conduct testing on. So the blood could have been Bob's, but we just don't know. As these two detectives are sifting through the evidence that thankfully is still in existence, they come across a pile of crime scene photos. Different photos of evidence from both the Cordoba, Carpenter's rental car, and Bob Crane's apartment. While they're looking at these pictures, all of a sudden, one comes up to the top of the pile, and it's what looks like a piece of brain matter or brain matter and skull. It looks human. And when they read where this picture was taken, it was taken inside the Cordoba. It was found inside a crease on the floor, like a ledge sort of, I don't know, thing inside the Cordoba. But no one picked it up and tagged and bagged it as evidence. Probably because it was too small and whoever was taking the photos didn't collect the evidence that they saw and took photos of. They just took the photos and walked away and probably didn't communicate that there was a piece of human skull lying on the floor. The size of this brain tissue, brain matter, skull matter was only 1/16 of an inch. So it was really tiny and possibly got overlooked. I'm playing devil's advocate. It should have been picked up the moment it was photographed, tagged, bagged, sealed in an evidence bag, but I digress. 1/16 of an inch, that's how tiny this little thing was. And to give you something for scale, a US penny is 1/16 of an inch thick. So that's how tiny this little piece of whatever it was. They had this picture. They didn't have the actual piece of evidence, but they had the picture in the evidence photos. So you could say that it did exist. So these two detectives take this picture to a whole bunch of experts. And these experts basically say it could be adipose tissue, which is fatty tissue, could be skull, could be brain matter, but it's definitely human tissue. I don't know how they determined that, considering they didn't have the piece of whatever it was in front of them. And we have to take it with a grain of salt because they're literally determining this off of a picture. Because the picture is taken inside Carpenter's rental car, they take it to a judge who allows it to be used and claims it's admissible as evidence and writes out an arrest warrant for Carpenter. So, in 1994, Carpenter is arrested and charged with the murder of Bob Crane. In an interview with the Arizona Republic newspaper in 1990, this is while Raines and Vassell are doing their new investigation, Bob Jr. states that he had serious reservations that the investigation was focused on the right party, that being Carpenter. He told the paper that he had not seen Carpenter since his father's funeral, and he couldn't come up with any clear motive for Carpenter to want to kill Bob. Bob Jr. also told the paper that he had 3 other suspects, 2 men and a woman, that he thought made better suspects than Carpenter. He stated that he even asked the police to investigate 2 of his suspects, but the police were so convinced that Carpenter was the killer that they declined to investigate the suspects. At this point in time, in 1990, Bob Jr. is a Hollywood publicist. So that's just something to keep in the back of your mind. But he's saying here he doesn't think that Carpenter was the killer. Okay. That's in 1990. 1994, Carpenter is arrested for his father's murder. And now we get to the trial. Now, I don't want to spend a lot of time on the trial because I could. I could spend days on this trial, but I'm not going to. But what I am going to do is I'm going to give you a list of the prosecution evidence and what the defense said to it, and we'll discuss it at the end. The police testified that John Carpenter was a suspect from day one because, Like I said earlier, when he called Bob's apartment the day his body was found, the phone was answered by a police officer, and Carpenter failed to ask if everything was all right. So right off the hop, that put him under suspicion. According to the police, they saw this phone call as returning to the scene of the crime. Now, ready for this one? Bob Crane Jr. testified at this trial that his father had informed him that he was tired of Carpenter being a hang-around and that he was a pain in the ass. Jr. also testified that his father had told him he was going to sever his friendship with Carpenter in the very near future. Bob Jr. also testified that Bob had called Carpenter the night before the murder and severed their friendship. Author Robert Graysmith, who wrote one of the first books on Bob Crane's death, stated that he had actually seen Bob Crane's appointment book that was beside his bed, and that all future appointments with Carpenter had been crossed out with X's. Now, go back to 1990, when Bob Crane Jr. is saying to the Arizona Press, "Oh, I don't know a motive why Carpenter would kill my father." What? How does the story change in 4 years? What happened in 4 years that all of a sudden you remember all this, an actual motive for Carpenter to kill your father? The police, Raines and Vassell, found 2 eyewitnesses that were sitting in the parking lot at 4:30 a.m. that morning, the morning that Bob's body was found. It was a moving company truck, and the person in the apartment above Bob was either moving in or moving out. I can't remember which. But this moving truck was for that person. And they were sitting in the parking lot at 4:30 waiting until 7:30, 8 o'clock or whatever when they could actually start to make noise. And they testified that at about 4:30 they saw a man peek outside the curtains of Bob's apartment. They said that the man then exited Bob's apartment with a coat draped over his arm and asked them to move their truck so he could get his car out. The man then got into a white car and drove away. And they said they didn't come forward until many years later when they saw Scotty, Bob's son with Patty Olson, on the news asking for help in solving Bob's murder. The police, if you remember, found blood on the curtain in Bob's living room. So this kind of says there's a man inside his apartment. It doesn't say what man, didn't give a description of the man, just that he drove a white car. Carpenter had a white Cordoba rental car. Now, the next piece of evidence they had was that on the rental car, there was a long scratch on the car, but the scratch was under the blood. The police believe that Carpenter threw the murder weapon out the window of the car and it scratched the door in the process. The next piece of evidence that they had was the picture of the human tissue or skull tissue or whatever it was. And remember, the judge who issued the arrest warrant said that this was admissible. So they were allowed to show this to the jury, this piece of human tissue that was in the Cordoba. The 2 investigators, Raines and Villas, what's his name? Vassell, that's his name. And they also find in the box of evidence the actual pillowcase from Bob's bed. And the pillowcase still has pieces of Bob's brain and skull on it. They were never collected. They were just left on the pillowcase and sealed in an evidence bag. So the 2 detectives start taking every little piece off of this pillowcase and start comparing it to the picture of what they think is brain matter, skull tissue, whatever. They determine that the picture was consistent with the pieces of human tissue that were still on the pillowcase. So then they consulted 3 medical examiners from New Mexico and Texas, asking them if the item in the picture could be the same as the remnants of skull and brain found on the pillowcase. All three medical examiners that they took it to concluded that the item in the picture was some type of human tissue, although they couldn't with certainty identify exactly what type of tissue it was. On September 29th, 1990, the police had found the white Cordoba that Carpenter had rented while in Scottsdale. The car had been abandoned in New Mexico. And when the police began examining it, they found blood in the door jamb. Okay, they found blood in the door jamb, but this is in 1990 and Bob was murdered in 1978, but this is 12 years after the murder. That blood could have belonged to anyone. And I couldn't find where they sent that blood out for testing, or if it was tested, if they got any results. So at this point, Rains and Vassal are trying to determine what the murder weapon was. They thought maybe it was a tire iron or a golf club. And when Dr. K, remember Dr. K? The medical examiner that none of us want to look at our body when we die. When he had climbed onto the bed to shave Bob's head, he told the police in the room on the video the weapon that made the 2 fatal wounds had to be heavy, long, and have an upturned end. The 2 marks on Bob's head were identical and symmetrical. A Phoenix criminologist was attempting to decipher what specifically had made the wounds. He'd been tasked with this job. He tried using a golf club and a tire iron and a whole bunch of different things on a clay head, but he couldn't get the wound pattern just exactly the same as what was on Bob's head. As well, there was that distinctive pattern on Bob's sheets. Remember, I said that they thought the killer had wiped the murder weapon off? Well, this criminologist thought, well, maybe he didn't wipe it off. Maybe he set it there and picked it up on his way out. Then the criminologist remembered that Bob had 2 tripods in his apartment, but only one was found inside the apartment that day. So he went out and bought an identical tripod to what Bob had. And then he conducted his testing. When he hit the clay head, it made the identical marks to what were on Bob's head. And when he laid the bloody tripod on a white sheet, it made the exact identical pattern that was found on Bob's sheet. So he had determined that the tripod that was missing was the murder weapon. Then we flash back to the scratch on the door of the Cordoba that was under the blood. Now the police believe that Carpenter was driving and had chucked the tripod out the window, leaving the scratch and the blood. As well, one other little tidbit about that tripod, it had been sold to Bob Crane by Carpenter. Here we go. Dr. K. There was a hair that was photographed on Bob's forehead that did not belong to Bob. It was long and black, which coincidentally is similar to color and length of Carpenter's hair at the time of the murder. However, when Dr. K climbed on the bed and shaved Bob's hair, that hair was lost in the sheets of the bed. It was gone. There was also evidence of dried semen on Bob's legs, on his thighs, but the police and Dr. K assumed that it was Bob's semen and didn't collect any of it. But maybe it should have been? Man, don't be murdered in Scottsdale, Arizona in 1978 because your murder's never going to be solved. So that was all the evidence that was against John Carpenter in this 1994 trial. That's it. That's all they had. It was all circumstantial, and half of it wasn't even present. It was missing. So the defense said the murder weapon being a tripod was based on pure speculation and the fact that Carpenter worked for an electronics company. That's it. They didn't acknowledge the work that the criminologist had done. They just said it's pure speculation, which, yeah, but he got definitive results. So the defense also found witnesses from the restaurant where Bob and Carpenter had had dinner the night before the murder and stated that the men had had a friendly dinner and there was no altercation. There was no evidence of ending a friendship between the two. It was a nice, cordial dinner. They picked up a couple women, and that was it. So, with all of this, the case went to the jury, and the jury came back and they acquitted John Carpenter. He was acquitted of the murder. According to Carpenter's wife, that in an interview that I saw later on, she said that until the day Carpenter died, he maintained his innocence and denied having anything to do with Bob's death. And according to her, the trial and just the speculation that was in all of the tabloids at the time took its toll physically on Carpenter. And she says that it ended his life prematurely because he aged so much from the stress. And I don't doubt it. So in 2016, John Hook, a Fox News anchor, received permission to retest the DNA samples that were found on the door of the Cordoba rental car. They made a great big deal out of it, and John Hook has written a book about the Bob Crane murder. And they had an actual broadcast which you can watch. And Bob Crane Jr. is there with him as they reveal the testing. And it came back that neither sample was from Bob Crane, and that the second sample came from an unknown male, and the other sample was too degraded to reach any conclusive results. So, unfortunately, I don't think that this murder is ever going to be solved. Now, I'm going to look at a few theories that I found on the internet. So, one theory that I came across was that Carpenter was in love with Bob and that Carpenter had propositioned Bob for a relationship and Bob refused. The refusal enraged Carpenter, who then lost control and beat Bob to death with the tripod. One of the police theories was that this killing was along the same lines as the murder of John Lennon by Mark David Chapman, a jealousy, envy, killing of the object of one's affections. So these two kind of go together. I don't see this as being fact. For two men that were best friends and that were so open with each other, I don't think that Carpenter would fly into a rage if he was rejected sexually by Bob. And I don't know, as straight as people say that Bob was, he did engage in threesomes and foursomes with Carpenter. I just don't see that as anything. Now, Robert Graysmith wrote a book about Bob Crane's death, which I've mentioned earlier. And in his book, he states that he has interviewed people that state that Carpenter wasn't able to score with any women on the visit to Scottsdale, Arizona that weekend. And that Graysmith, he thinks that Carpenter would have been insanely jealous that Bob was getting the women and not him, and that would have caused him to beat Bob to death. But I seriously doubt that. If Bob introduced Carpenter as his manager and the two of them made it a thing for both of them to get women. So I don't think that that's true, but that's just my opinion. Ronnie Richards, an actress who played on the Bob Crane show with Bob, stated to the press at one point, and I don't know when this actually happened because there was no date on the interview, but she stated that Bob and Carpenter had had a falling out prior to Bob's murder. According to Ronnie, there were two incidents that caused the falling out of the two besties. The first was that Bob had witnessed Carpenter beating a woman, which was not okay in Bob's books. And the second was that Carpenter had approached Bob sexually and that Bob was 100% straight and rebuked Carpenter's advances. I don't know how much faith I put in this theory because the Bob Crane show was in 1975 and then it only did 13 episodes and then it was canceled. And then Bob went on to the dinner theater and started traveling. So I don't know how much in contact he stayed with Ronnie Richards. But if Bob witnessed Carpenter beating a woman, if that's true, then that lays a little bit of history of Carpenter being a violent person. And I could see Bob standing in or stepping in and putting a stop to it, and maybe that got violent. But I question how close Ronnie Richards and Bob Crane were, as their time of working together had been over. Now, the last theory I'm going to talk about is from Bob Jr. Now, Bob Jr., throughout the years, has hooked his wagon with John Hook, the Fox News anchor. And most of the times that John Hook appears on television discussing this murder, Bob Jr. isn't too far behind and usually appears as well. But remember when Bob Jr. back in 1990 said that he didn't think it was Carpenter, he thought it was someone else? Well, Bob Jr.'s theory at that point was that Bob's ex-wife, Patty Olson, had something to do with Bob's murder because of the will. Bob Jr. said that when Bob was married to Patty, the will had been changed and everything got left to Patty. I guess if Patty was desperate for money, maybe. But even though Bob thought he was broke and had to do dinner theater, he actually wasn't as broke as what he thought. He had all the residuals of Hogan's Heroes coming in. Plus, he owned a piece of the dinner theater, which continued after his death. She's probably a really rich woman now. Hogan's Heroes is on 5 days a week, and he gets money every time it's on. So even to this day, she's receiving residuals from that. But the police never looked at Patty in any capacity for the murder of Bob. They had complete tunnel vision on Carpenter. And so, unfortunately, to this day, 2024, the murder of Bob Crane is still unsolved. And unfortunately, with the degradation of the blood samples and most of the characters in this case having already passed away, I don't think it's ever going to be solved. My thoughts. My thoughts about this case are different. I have many questions about this case. A lot of it has to do with the police incompetence that happened at that crime scene. So here are some of my questions. The semen on Bob's legs, why was it not collected and tested? The fridge. How did Victoria know there was beer in the fridge? Why did she open the fridge when she was looking for Bob? As well, why was Bob Jr. allowed to grab a six-pack and take it with him when he left the crime scene? Why were people allowed and brought to the crime scene before it had been examined thoroughly? The cord around Bob's neck, why? It's superfluous. It's unnecessary. Bob was already dead from the blow to the head. So why tie a cord? The only thing I can think of is that it was symbolic. Somehow that cord was a symbol of the relationship that Bob had to his killer. What if he picked up a girl and it was true that he filmed them without their knowing, and the husband or the boyfriend found out about it and came back and killed him, beat him? Doesn't that make more sense than a best friend coming in and bludgeoning him? The brain matter on the pillow. Why was it never collected? Why was the pillow not tested? There could have been a fingerprint in the blood. If someone is hitting someone that hard with a tripod or any instrument for that matter, there's a really good chance that they may lose balance as they're bringing down the weapon and have to place their hand on the pillow or the bed in order to gain stability for the next blow. That pillow was never tested. Bob Jr.'s story. Why did it change from 1990 to 1994? What happened in those 4 years that would change his focus from not being Carpenter to being Carpenter? The Cordoba evidence. Where did it go? Why was it not collected? Where was Patty during the murder of Bob Crane? And who was she seeing at the time of Bob Crane's murder? Did Patty have something to do with it? Did she want the money that Bob had? Was she tired of fighting this nasty divorce and wanted it over quicker? Was she still angry because Bob was stepping out on her with all these beautiful young women and she wanted revenge? Where are Bob's phone records for the day before the murder? Who did he call? How many times did he call them? That's something I would really like to know. Do you remember that Bob Jr. said there was a pack of cigarettes and an overflowing ashtray? Where did it go? Was it collected? Was the cigarette pack tested for fingerprints or any of the cigarette butts tested for DNA? Who smoked all those cigarettes? And why was there so many in the ashtray? Was it a girl that Bob had at the apartment before he was murdered? And did that person see whoever came to kill Bob on their way out? Or was it the murderer themselves, planning on what they were going to do after they murdered Bob? These are just some of the questions I have. And honestly, most of this evidence was never collected, so there's really no way that we're ever going to know anything definitively. Bob was notorious for going to bars and picking up women and taking them back to his apartment to have sexual exploits with them. And as far as I can tell, they were consensual exploits, which I have no shame to Bob. I mean, if he liked sex and was consensual, as long as he was respectful of the women that he had sex with, do your thing, buddy. All I know is that a really great talent was murdered, probably over something stupid like money or sex. The world lost a great talent that day. It just leaves more questions. While I was doing all this research, I found one final fact about Carpenter. On June 9th, 1992, Carpenter was arraigned on 3 counts of lewd conduct with a child. 2 of the victims were the 10-year-old daughter of Carpenter's then girlfriend and a 12-year-old friend of the daughter. The 3rd count was that Carpenter had molested his girlfriend back when she was 15. Another of Carpenter's girlfriends told a newspaper that she and Carpenter had had sexual relations 3 days after her 13th birthday. On November 10th, 1992, Carpenter pled no contest to one of the 3 charges. This was a plea deal in which the other 2 charges were dropped, and he was sentenced to 3 years probation. Man, I don't know. I didn't come across that tidbit until the very end of my research. And once I read that put more suspicion on Carpenter. Honestly, I don't know who killed Bob Crane. About 150 mourners attended the funeral at St. Paul the Apostle Church in Westwood, California. Patty Duke, John Aston, Carol O'Connor, and Bob's Hogan's Heroes castmates all attended his funeral. According to one author, a man who'd sought love in dangerous places suddenly had it in abundance. Well, that was kind of all over the place, that case, wasn't it? There's a lot of ins and outs. I don't know. It's so sad. And I mean, a lot of people will look down on Bob for having an addiction to sex, but as long as you're healthy about it and respectful of the partners you have. I mean, he wasn't respectful of his wives by doing this, but they also knew about it, and divorce was a thing in the 1970s. I hope you enjoyed that episode. I enjoyed researching this one. There was a lot of things I didn't know about this, and I'd always seen it everywhere because everybody's done this one, but I really enjoyed it, and I wish that the samples had been taken care of and that we could have actually retested them now with the technology that we have. Because if we had the technology we have now back in 78, we would know who killed Bob Crane. I hope you have a wonderful week. I hope you enjoy the beautiful weather as we're coming into spring. And if you do enjoy this episode and you enjoy listening to me tell you about true crime, please head over to the Patreon page, The Bitter Witness at Patreon. There's a link in the notes of the show for you to go on over there. I know some people have had a hard time finding it. I have an 18 plus thing on it on Patreon. So if you can't find it on your own, come back here and go into the show notes, and there is a link there for you. For just a few cents a day, you get access to the bitter bits, and you also help me to continue doing the things I love, which is research and telling you about true crime. I will see you soon with another case, and enjoy your day today. This has been a Bitter Witness production.